Another funny thing about how they're trying to stick it to us is, okay, in the 2015 lawsuit, when we reapproached and found all these songs and everything, they briefly brought up the argument that in the divorce decree, there is no mention of streaming royalties, and that we should not be entitled to streaming royalties because it's not expressly written into the divorce decree. But obviously, the streaming royalties did not exist, back in '73.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Okay, today we're picking up with episode 2 of the interviews with Travis and Kelly Campbell. These are the 2 of the 3 children that were born to Billie Jean Campbell, and she died in 93. So if you've not watched episode 1, be sure and watch episode 1 of this interview in order for this to make sense. As a matter of fact, it'll make the most sense if you go back and watch the previous one from this series relating to the children of Glen Campbell. And that earlier episode is one in which it's with Travis and his wife, Trudy. So it's helpful if you've seen that interview before you go to the ones with the siblings, Travis and his sister, Kelly. But in any case, this is the second episode of the Travis and Kelly interview, and I hope that you find it enjoyable and very enlightening. Take care. Whenever we're talking about royalties or intellectual property as it pertains to songs, the people who write it, they get paid royalties. The people there are performance royalties related to any time someone plays a recording of anyone performing it, then that's a royalty. And then additionally, people pay royalties to actually perform the song new and afresh.
Right.
So your dad didn't write many. He wasn't really a songwriter per se.
Jimmy Webb wrote the majority of the songs.
Yeah, thankfully he and Jimmy Webb came together because it was the best thing for both of them in terms of music history.
So, okay, getting back to why we filed it. Okay, mind you, we had really no idea about the Glen Campbell music and Seventh Son up until that point, but we wanted to see the statements directly from Capital UMG to ensure that they were living up to their bargain of the 2012 agreement.
And this is the money that was to be paid directly to you without you paying this service charge.
That wasn't being paid directly to us.
Yeah. But the point is, the agreement was you were to receive it directly without any payment of a fee
20%.
to Schneider. But I want people to understand something here too, and this might be repeated a couple times during the course of our final edited version. But that we have on the one hand these songs that relate primarily to Capitol records, in which these were the big hits, and these were expressly awarded because they occurred during the marriage among anything else he recorded during the course of the marriage. 50% of those were just plainly given to your mother, and she was to be given that in perpetuity, and when she died, you all were to get 50% of all the royalties that Glenn would have gotten relating to his biggest hits, mainly in the 70s.
Everything up from the beginning of his career to Rhinestone Cowboy.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot of good stuff.
It's all of them.
Yeah, it's everything.
Yeah.
And so, and then separately was this award of the 40%, or they call it 40 shares, which represented 40% of Glen Campbell Music, Inc. And this apparently was a company that was created by Glenn and his business manager Schneider and perhaps others, in which the intention was to be in the business of acquiring other people's recording rights, other royalties, performance, publishing. So that was a good concept for a business to buy into other musicians' catalogs, and they did that. So
that's what Alan Jackson was originally signed under, was Glen Campbell Music. And then, mind you, when they created Glen Campbell Music, Inc. or publishing, is kind of during the time when he had his TV show. You know what I mean? So a lot of people that he would have on his show, he would, hey, let me take care of your publishing. You know what I mean?
It was a great idea, and so. So your mother, is marital property. So the settlement in the divorce gave her a 40% interest in that company. not in specific songs, but that company owned at that time.
In the totality of the company.
Yeah, the word was very clear. It was 40% of the company. So,
Sure.
That's universally understood to mean all the assets that are owned by a company.
Exactly. She had 40%. Dad had 40%. Stan Schneider had 10%.
Nick Savano had 10.
And
Nick
had been
Savano was my dad's original manager.
Original manager,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Dickie.
So what people should understand, and what I found so disingenuous, is that when you filed this action in 2010 and you demanded of Schneider or Guernsey Schneider, which is the CPA firm, when you demanded of them the records and accounting, you wanted to understand what you were entitled to. And
Exactly.
After you had pushed far enough and I've read these court documents, and you all went to extraordinary lengths to get this discovery, not to mention to get the deposition that you finally got. It became clear that their position had been to pay you for whatever songs that were owned by Glen Campbell Music at the time of the divorce. That's an interpretation that I would blush if I were making that argument to a judge, that that's the way I thought and genuinely believe that that's what the document meant. Because can't imagine a lawyer thinking that could be interpreted that way. But they were in a position where they couldn't make any other argument without an admission that they had deliberately. Trying not to use the word. I'm not going to use the word fraud.
Sure.
But the point is that allegation certainly could have been made, and so they're in a position of making a silly argument because they're caught with their hand in the cookie jar, meaning, there's virtual evidence here that they chose to pay on a theory that made no sense. And
Right.
so,
Exactly.
and furthermore, you didn't realize the magnitude of their investments that had gone on. So, and this was granted, I believe in the testimony that it was a mistake. It doesn't change the fact that it happened. I guess it was Schneider's testimony. He testified that it was a mistake, that they should have, from that point on, not put any more assets into the Glen Campbell Music Company, because 40% of it, of course, would be owned by your mother and eventually you all.
Right.
But the point is, the mistake was made. They continued acquiring music and acquiring other royalties and intellectual property in the name of Glen Campbell Music.
And on top of that, Dad bought, I think it's a 10 or a 20% interest in the Arizona Diamondbacks, and that money came from Glen Campbell Music. Okay, and then that's what scared the tar out of them originally. When they offered the $400,000, because our attorney was going to say that since it was paid for by Glen Campbell Music, that we should be entitled to a percentage of the Arizona Diamondbacks.
And I think that was. I imagine if we could step into, be a fly on the wall in the offices of Schneider with his lawyers and maybe Kim and others, when they realized that all these assets had continued to go into a company in which your mother and then you were 40% owners. And so I think that's what stimulated this deal. And as we talked about earlier, I understand why you took the deal. You couldn't imagine that there were all these assets out there that had been continued to be placed in this company after the divorce. But I think that the law normally would be very clear. I mean, after a divorce, when somebody, say the husband divorces the wife with his company and she gets 40%, and he goes on putting stuff in his company, acquiring assets, real estate, whatever it might be, of course the law is clear. She's owned 40% of the company. So I kind of wince. I wince because for you, but for all three of you, because I feel like from what I've read that it was, you just couldn't have known what you were entitled to at that time. And thankfully you recovered some of it, but there's no way for you to have known this. And I come back, and I won't keep raising the issue of the trustee, But I'm curious what Larry or Lawrence Turner would say. Why did he not pick up the gauntlet and charge? I mean, he had enough information to know this smelt bad.
He did.
He had a duty to you all, at least prior to age 40. He had a duty, and that money was never paid.
And grant you, I mean, again, I'm not trying to let him off the hook, but now he's pretty involved. I mean, but he's an attorney. I think he should write stronger letters. But that's what really upset me about when we did our action for the 2015 action, because once we did receive the statement, we finally received the UMG catalogs. That's when we got Shannon Lynn involved, our forensic accountant. And mind you, Shannon Lynn has been so incredible. He worked with Casey Kasem, cataloging all of his radio stuff, and he's a fan of Dad's. He went through those catalogs. That's why I said he's the one that found that there was over 420 songs that we weren't being paid on. Okay, mind you, the way that Stan had calculated it is we were being paid like on these albums, but where Shannon found out is like on all the Lifetime CDs and all these best of CDs and all this, they weren't taking each individual song,
Yeah.
And it was just amazing. And then that came out to almost like 300,000. And then when the court action was going on in Nashville, they gave us a check for 159, but they still owe us 159. So
that litigation to some extent goes on, right?
Yeah. And like I said, Trudy does a great job. I mean, she's not an attorney, but she writes up the brief. She does a great job. And then we filed it in Nashville, and everything was great. And I think we would have prevailed. But the judge said, since we weren't beneficiaries. I mean, we filed it in the
wrong court.
Yeah, we filed it as well. Okay, they were closing out the conservatorship, and that's where we filed it. And the judge said we couldn't file as we filed it. We had to file it as a creditor. Do you understand what I'm saying?
No,
Jim?
I understand. So in a probate estate, you can file as a creditor, which means that you have a claim against the estate. You're not asserting yourself as a beneficiary and trying to overturn the terms of the will itself. Is that accurate?
We should have
filed. We filed it incorrectly. I mean, we probably should have.
Okay.
That's what we. So that's where I'm saying now we're going to go get another attorney and file it.
We've got to find an attorney.
Are you available, Joe?
Well, I'm not sure I'd want to step into this long train of hardship and litigation. Yeah. But I can tell you, I could imagine sinking my teeth into a situation like this where there aren't the sort of, I guess, limitations based on settlements in the past, as well as statutes of limitation. And sure. I think that you're rubbing up against those as it pertains to any of the professional advice you got, and perhaps even relating to your trustee. I would have to check on that, but I suspect that started running when he ceased to be your trustee. And I know that you have these personal relationships that mean something to you. Sure. And you're, some of these people you respect, and you don't sound vindictive at all.
I try not to be. For me, that's one thing that I really had to work on from the original lawsuit when I saw how vindictive she was being.
When you say she, you mean Kim?
Kim. So
in the 2012 lawsuit, though, as we've talked already, the persons named were Larry Turner, the trustee, and this was for an accounting, and also Schneider and his firm, and also for an accounting. This is the 2012 litigation, but we know that intricately affected by this is Kim, and exactly. Kim, was she involved to some extent?
Completely. She was the one who decided everything on their end, everything for Gershie Schneider. She was the one who decided everything for their end, on Gershie Schneider's part. She didn't want to pay us a dime. She didn't want to pay us a dime. She had to approve.
You think then that she fully appreciated how much money was that they potentially would have to pay you and encourage the settlement?
Honestly, I don't know, but I think Stan had to know. I mean, he there's no way he could be
Well, Stan knew for sure, but
exactly.
The question...
And I'm sure he relayed that to Kim because Kim did not want to give us anything. And I'm sure Kim had to approve it. I'm sure Stan told him, Kim, this is the best scenario. When I signed that document, I had a real problem with the known or unknown. And my attorney explained it to me. He goes, if you sign this and you accept this, you cannot go back for anything you find out in the future, except for fraud. I considered what they continue to do fraud, in the 2015 thing, but it's hard to prove.
Well, yeah, and sometimes even fraud. Depending on, this is California law that's at work here, because the case was in California, but. To revisit that for the benefit of our viewers is routinely when you have a defendant who wants to settle a case, you can expect them to include the broadest language possible so that they get, in exchange for paying you X amount of money, they get to wipe out the risk as widely and completely as possible. So routinely there is language such as all claims known or unknown. In this case, I can see how it'd be hard to find a basis to go back for that money.
Sure.
Now, as we've mentioned, Kelly would still, I don't see a problem with her having a claim now. And yet I see the fact that she's reluctant to having watched what you went through, how many years it was, and the hassle.
Something very interesting. Okay, I'm not sure if we told you last time. We kind of reached out to, I believe his name is Peter Anderson. He's Cher's attorney who won the recent thing for Cher against Mary Bono. Did we touch on that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, so he won that. And then I just had an article, I'll send it to you guys, that Mary Bono is continuing on. She's like appealing, what the judge had already ruled, stating that Cher should have no interest in the royalty rights. And it's strange how they kind of piggyback off each other. But then in the article that I'll send you, in that article, it states that a California judgment, such as a divorce decree, supersedes federal copyright law because there's something called a copyright recapture. After a certain amount of years, you supposedly lose your right, but since it was a California judgment, and then I like that because that's what we rely on is our California judgment of my mom's divorce decree with our rights.
Yeah. Generally, states are very protective of property that's awarded in the course of a divorce. They regard that as peculiarly within the province of state law, and I can see how, the federal government, it would raise a constitutional issue to the extent they're wanting to supersede state property rights. So, yeah, and there are opportunities to change the deals that are struck in selling intellectual property. That law was actually, it was named after somebody we had looked at in the past, Justin. We did a show on this. Buddy Holly.
Buddy Holly, okay.
Yeah, Buddy Holly, it's called the Buddy Holly statute or amendment, and it was intended to give a chance to renegotiate deals in which somebody sells or transfers copyright. So it gives the family a second bite at the apple, effectively.
And then another funny thing about how they're trying to stick it to us is, okay, in the 2015 lawsuit, when we reapproached and found all these songs and everything, they briefly brought up the argument that in the divorce decree, there is no mention of streaming royalties and that we should not be entitled to streaming royalties because it's not expressly written into the divorce decree. But obviously, the streaming royalties did not exist, back in '73, But they did not pursue it. They did not pursue it.
Okay. So as we kind of wrap up here,
sure.
And this has been a good conversation. So talk a little bit about, have you had any communications with Kim at all? Where does that sit?
Nothing. Not at all.
Not since Dad died. Not since Dad. Not since they read the will. And I was shocked. I was just shocked.
I mean, I don't know if I told you, but at Dad's funeral, she wouldn't even let me be a pallbearer.
And of course, some of this triggered the legislation. You all testified in Tennessee.
Sure. Yep. Because that's kind of what started I no offense, but I can't stand lawyers.
I don't like most lawyers myself. So.
But I say that jokingly. Of course,
I understand. Go ahead.
But I've been having to go through all this. When Dad passed away, we had to hire an attorney out there. Before Dad passed away, my older sister Debbie, and I had to hire an attorney and pursue legal action just to be able to see Dad, because Kim didn't even want us seeing my father. Once we found out where he was in the rest home, we went and saw him, and then the next day we came, and then the people there had said that Kim had said that Dad did not need any visitors that day, any more visitors, And then I called up Stan Schneider, the manager, and I said, Stan, unless they let us back in here, I'm going to call the press and have the press here. And then so that's when we filed our action just to be able to see Dad. And then that's what initiated the legislation in Nashville, in Tennessee. It was originally called the Campbell-Falk Act, but Kim fought and was successful in removing the Campbell name from the bill. I think it's called the Senate Bill 1070, I believe. But it just means that if you have the right to be able to have visitors, mail, and telephone calls from a loved one, as long as they're not a detriment, to your health or to your well-being.
So you all, though, during the course of this legislation winding its way through the House there and the Senate in the state of Tennessee, you all testified before a subcommittee.
Correct. Before the Senate. This is very interesting. And Tanya Tucker testified on our behalf as well. Kim's attorney, her name at the time was Carolyn Schott. They didn't know, the Senate did not know that she was Kim's attorney. She ran around and lobbied to the Senate, to the senators, the state senators there in at the legislature against the bill. And in the hearing, she presented herself. They presented her as the expert from the State Bar of Tennessee why this bill should not be passed. Okay, so this is going on, and then Dad's name keeps coming up, and Dad's name should have no mention of for this bill because it is about Dad, but it doesn't just directly affect Dad. And then the senators finally asked her. Her name was Carolyn Schott. The senators finally asked her, do you represent Kim Campbell? And then when she said yes, there was like an aghast in the courtroom. It's on videotape. I could send you the videotape. And subsequently, the senators wrote they wrote a letter complaining that it was an ethics breach on her behalf. What she did. She never informed them that she was Kim's representation. She just represented herself as the Tennessee State Bar representative, as
a public advocate or something.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
But this legislation now assures that a family can have access to their loved ones, especially when we're talking about a family in which there was divorce and there's estrangement between a second wife or a second husband. Those are probably the most common scenarios.
Sure. But one thing that's curious about it, okay, when we filed our action, we had mediation, and then we had a mediated settlement agreement with Kim that we could see Dad for 4 hours at a time, twice a month or something like that. So we signed the mediated settlement agreement. So when the legislation was passed, it didn't affect us because we had already had a mediated settlement agreement, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because right when the legislation was passed, Debbie showed up at the place, and they weren't going to let her in. And she showed them the bill, and then I didn't understand that legally, since we had a mediated settlement agreement, it did not pertain to us because our settlement agreement was prior to the legislation being passed.
So why do you think, though, that Kim was not wanting to allow the visit? I don't see any purpose in that.
I honestly don't know.
Debbie was taking pictures, I think. She was taking pictures, and Kim didn't want pictures.
For me, I hope it wasn't out of spite, But I know there was some spite because she would not allow Trudy, my wife, to go in with me to see my father. She made her wait out in the car for 4 hours while I visited my father in the memory care facility. And then the only reason we sealed that case in Tennessee was because we didn't want anyone to know where Dad was, because it would have been public record where he was at. So we sealed the case, and then she ended up using that against us because since it was sealed, we couldn't talk about it.
Yeah. So your dad, he went into an institution for care. This was, I assume, immediately following the conclusion of his final tour.
Exactly. Dad wanted to do 12 shows, farewell tour shows. Kim put him out on the road for 154 dates, in his early 80s, onset Alzheimer's. Pushed him until he broke down on stage. And she was making a documentary this whole time. Right after the documentary, boom, pops him in a memory care facility. Wouldn't tell us where he was. We found out where he was, went and saw him. And the next day she tried to have us.
So was that tour profitable?
I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was very profitable. Most of the places they played was sold out.
Yeah.
I mean, I called it the last Dash for Cash Money tour for Kim,
Well, I saw parts of that, and your dad, he was amazingly good on stage, at least
Sure.
the portions I saw. But I'm sure over time, of course, in his condition, he's not going to have much stamina.
Kelly, tell about Kelly was in the limo with him, I think in New York, and Dad was like breaking down, didn't want to go on stage.
He was going to jump out of the car. I mean, it was horrible. He did not. I mean, it was like she was leading like a puppy dog. It was awful. He did not want to do the shows, and because he knew that he was faltering.
Well, how was he doing during those shows? Did he hold up toward the end? He did seem to have this amazing ability, which I think is true of somebody who's done something their whole life. It
was like automatic. But one of the shows, it was like I remember he had done Phoenix, and then the next song he went right back into starting Phoenix again. But mainly it was just people that were showing their love, and they knew it was going to be the last time they saw him. It was like a love fest.
And again, I just want to say, I appreciate that you bring up the fact. I mean, I try not to have animosity. It's very difficult. I mean, I believe in forgiveness. I'm more interested in people being educated and finding out new information that they can use for themselves rather than any kind of retribution.
Yeah. No, I think you all have been very fair-minded, and naturally there's an edge there because you've been through this personally, and our viewers understand, when you've lived that personally, and you've been on the receiving end of some exploitation, for lack of a better word, at least from a financial standpoint. So, it's hard to not feel some resentment. So from my perspective, I tried to be fair to Kim too, in the sense from a person who knows so little about the details, as you all know. And yet, I can see where from some perspectives, somebody would say, gee, she came into his life and things got better for him. But you're seeing it from a different perspective. You're seeing, as family members, how that affected you. And then, of course, the finances, it's, what was it? How did they word it? You don't know somebody until you've gone through probate with them. I mean, it's, it sometimes brings out the worst.
I just want to ask Kelly. Kelly, have you seen his original podcast that prompted me to call him?
Yeah.
He pretty much nailed everything.
Yeah.
Except for Kim's name. I think he called her Debbie or not Debbie.
Yeah, sorry about that.
But he had it down, except for he didn't know everything.
Yeah.
So it was, and just to remind our viewers, they can go back and watch that. But the gist of it was that she had herself in a position where she had a duty to all the beneficiaries, and she submitted claims that pretty much ate up all the available money that hadn't gone into trusts already that was available in the probate estate in claims relating to her expenses, which, that produces a conflict, and it wasn't the right arrangement. That was, in my opinion, a mistake in the estate planning.
Yeah.
And especially when you do that, when there are children, stepchildren, who are in a position to be adversely affected by the person who is named as a personal representative or a trustee. I think often it's a mistake to name the stepmom in that role when you can choose independent third parties. One final question before we wrap up. So it sounds like Schneider, was it Ted?
Stan.
It sounds like Stanley Schneider was almost a friend of the family, meaning of Kim and Glenn. Their relationship was more than just business. How did that happen? Was he just around for a long time?
Yeah, Stan started doing Dad's taxes, way, way back. When Dad first came to LA, I really don't know how they originally first met. He started doing his taxes, and then he opened up, the management company, and then just kind of, blossomed from there, I guess,
We grew up with Stan.
It hurts me because I have conversations with Stan where I almost considered him almost like a second father, because when Dad was kind of getting, when he started declining, Stan's like, oh, don't tell your dad. Don't tell your dad. Don't tell your dad. So it's like I didn't go to Dad with a lot of my problems. I'd go to Stan, and Stan was misleading me.
See, 30 years ago, when I wanted to sue Stan, Travis, he still liked Stan, and didn't want to go against Stan.
So Stan was somebody that as a child growing up, you regularly saw in your home.
Oh, yeah, we had holiday meals together, vacations together over Christmas.
Anytime, like if I needed, obviously, they paid for our school and stuff, but for example, when I bought my first house, I borrowed some money from Dad, and, he said, just go ask Stan. Dad didn't deal with anything financial. It was, go ask Stan.
Stan did everything. Yeah.
Yeah. But Stan was an intimate, almost a family member, because he had gotten in so early in this relationship with your dad. And I'm sure that he very carefully protected and nurtured that relationship. And I'm sure he made some good decisions, of course, and maybe a lot of good decisions.
Oh, yeah. Like the Oakwood investment. I'm brand new. He made money for Dad,
But I think that what's sad about this is once there came to a fork in the road between his relationship with your dad and your dad's wife.
Exactly. Once Kim became the controlling or the person who made the decisions, that's when the problem started. When Dad would start declining, Kim became the authoritative person with all financial decisions.
But it does seem like Stan was pretty generously compensated, and I wonder even
very generously compensated.
But I wonder though, even before your mother died, was Stan regularly getting something like 20% off of the top of royalties?
Yeah.
Your dad lacked financial sophistication. And your mother, I'll jump to the conclusion, she lacked that too. And so, and that is common in your industry and in the music industry generally. So people in that position are in such a notoriously opportunistic environment where it's really up to their being fastidious about integrity and about candor and being selfless in terms of their what's called a fiduciary duty. Those things often get shunted aside at some point, and I think in part it's because of the temptation on the part of business managers, and you see this with rock bands. It's legendary with rock bands. Managers who the temptation is so great because their clients unlike, if you're an executive and you have a business manager, you're talking to them on even ground. But in this relationship between, for example, the extreme example of a rock band and a business manager, there's such a gulf between their understanding of what's going on and such opportunity for that business manager to take a little more or to write themselves into things, and often they do. The financial circumstances of rock stars, the history is littered with decisions that were made in which they signed things that later they said I shouldn't have signed. So this case is not as conspicuously one of those, but in many ways maybe it is that we don't know maybe the extent to which the business manager was paid more by your dad than he should have been, but we certainly know what happened after your mother died. And you have to wonder, if that happened then, could there have been other things before and your dad would never know the difference? Because I didn't realize until you started explaining this how he had become a family member.
Yeah, Christmas, Thanksgiving. His Stan's kids, his wife. Yeah.
So he was a trusted advisor, and there's a point at which you quit asking questions of trusted advisors, meaning you don't doubt them. You place increasingly large levels
Stan,
of confidence.
Dad had implicit trust in Stan.
Yeah, and it sounds like Kim has continued the relationship.
Sure.
So I think unfortunately this fork comes in the road where Stan's forced to decide, where his loyalties are, and of course we know what that decision was going to be before it happened.
Yeah, he's retired. He's older. Wish him the best. Yeah, he had to fly into Nashville to testify a few times, and the last time he testified, he did it via Zoom.
Yeah, I could tell from the deposition that he didn't seem to have a lot of facts at his fingertips. So this discussion has been really, I think, enlightening in many ways. It's interesting because it involves somebody that is much loved and much respected and admired, your dad. It's also interesting because there's lots of twists and turns in the assets that were passed along to your mother, first in the divorce and then thereafter to you all through her trust. And the fact that you had to rely on a third party to do the accounting and tell you if the amount of money you're getting is correct. And I'll add this factor, which doesn't help. You had a trustee that seemed remarkably incurious about these matters. And in fact, to the extent that you had to include them in the lawsuit to try to get information. It's just really troubling to me that the trustee, and I would want to be fair to Larry Turner, and I would happily talk to him about such things, but it just seems at the end of the day, he's the one who, as a trustee, had a duty to be monitoring these things.
I completely agree.
Okay, so this concludes this second episode of the interview with Travis and Kelly. Wow. What challenges they have faced and how complicated it can be. I hope that this was not only interesting for you, but I think it may remind you that while you may not have some of the complications relating to such things as royalties and other intellectual property that you might inherit or be intended to be the recipient of in someone's pre-existing trust, you need to think about having in place the expertise by way of a manager, a trustee, somebody who has the wherewithal and the expertise to be able to enforce your rights. I think that's one of the big lessons walking away from these conversations relating to the children of Glen Campbell is that it's not enough to be awarded rights. You have to have the ability to enforce them, and you have to have a willingness to expend the effort and time and money to do that. It can be a lot of work. So if you're the one who's preparing a trust and you have assets that are potentially very complicated, particularly intangible assets, sometimes real estate interests get very arcane, be sure that you simplify it to the extent you can in terms of titles, but also place at the top of your trust an institutional trustee if necessary that will have the expertise and the capability of enforcing the rights that you've been given or that you intend to give in your trust. So that's my best advice to you relating to this. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you've learned a lot. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.